everyone, I'm Jess Thompson, Content Manager for Learning and Development at ATD. Welcome back to the Ask a Trainer series. On today's episode, my guest Heidi Kirby and I are discussing 10 questions to ask when you're interviewing instructional designers. Hi Heidi, thanks so much for joining me on this episode of Ask a Trainer today. How are you doing?
Good, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. All right, well, did you want to introduce yourself for folks that may not know who you are and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Absolutely. So I'm Heidi Kirby. I currently work in my day job as a customer education manager, managing instructional designers and a technical trainer for product training and for end customers. And before that, I was kind of your more traditional instructional designer. And even before that, I was an English professor. So I did the very popular educator to instructional designer career transition about 5 years ago, give or take a few. And I also pursued a PhD in instructional design, and I just defended my dissertation successfully a week and a half ago. So when I graduate in December, I'll officially be Dr. Heidi Kirby, which is super exciting. I also am really active in the L&D community and really believe in giving back. That's why I'm here today. But I also host an L&D podcast called The Block, or Building Learning and Oral Culture podcast. And I've started Useful Stuff, which is a newsletter that's going to grow into other resources for L&D professionals with my L&D bestie, Matt Smith.
Awesome. Well, first of all, congratulations on defending your dissertation. That's so exciting. How do you feel?
Good. It didn't sink in. Like, it sunk in the first day, and then it didn't. And then, like, this past week, when it had been a full week, I was like, I've been unofficially Dr. Heidi Kirby for an entire week. And I'm like,
that's
and
so
I'm going to
exciting.
keep being it for more and more weeks.
Yeah, man, that's so awesome. Well, Heidi, you wrote this incredible post called 10 Questions to Ask When Interviewing Instructional Designers. And you answered some of those questions on your podcast, which was fantastic. And I would highly recommend folks check out Heidi's podcast if you haven't listened to it yet. And thought it would be a great idea to answer some of those questions here. So what do you think, Heidi?
Let's do it.
Let's start with the first question. So tell me about a time when you persuaded a stakeholder, a SME, or team member to see things your way. What was the situation and how did you convince them?
So first, I want to say before I start answering these that sometimes I may not give exactly the same answer that I would give in an interview, or I might give some extra context just to give people tips. But particularly for this question, what's important about it is showing that building of trust and being able to show how you gained support from someone, right? And like how you built that relationship in order to do that. So the example that I would give would have to be with one of the senior leaders that I worked with when I was at NASA. We were trying to do things that were quite different from what they had done before. Their e-learning courses were very much like PowerPoints with narration, right? And it was just like page turners of slides and slides. And so we were trying to do more of like scenario-based e-learning courses and give people kind of like immersive scenarios or examples to go along with it. And these were courses on like safety topics. So we're not talking like space flight or anything like that, but safety, and safety is boring, right? Like, so trying to give examples to make it come to life a little bit more, and having that be so different than everything else that was in the course catalog, we had to show the leader like what we were doing at each step. And I think that was a really important part of gaining buy-in, was like, let's do a storyboard first, right? Like, let's show her what it could look like. And then, meet with her. And we were meeting with her. I think we had a standing meeting once a week to just really keep her posted and like let her see what we had done and, what our ideas were. And then we would go back and work with our subject matter expert on like, is this a really good example? And one of the things that we did was we took like a really generic example that anyone from any background could understand. And then we went to a more specific safety engineering example. And so by showing the storyboard, building out that first very simple scenario, by just giving her bits and pieces as we were going and keeping her in the loop so that she could see what it was going to look like, I think that really helped to gain the buy-in. And then when the next course came along, she's like, yeah, do your thing. So.
Wow, I really love that. It sounds like you really built trust with that SME and helped by keeping them in the loop. You built that trust and you were able to demonstrate kind of the importance and the significance of the decisions that you were making. And that really made the difference.
Yeah. And there's a difference too between like sending someone everything or having them like watched over your shoulder, right?
Yeah.
And I know some people get a little bit self-conscious or territorial about their work or defensive. Like there are feelings with that, right?
Yeah.
And so having those set points of like, we're going to meet every week and whatever I've worked on, I'm going to bring to you can really help you as like the designer feel a little bit better about that like back and forth, that you don't feel like someone's just invasively like or crowdsourcing work, right?
I love that. That's awesome. Okay, so next question. Think about one of your most recent ID projects. Can you explain your design process from idea to implementation?
Yeah, so this is actually pretty recent because even though I'm in a managerial position now, I was down instructional designers this year. So I had to design and develop some of the courses myself. And there were limited resources, right? And we're used to that, right? Instructional designers, we're used to having limited resources. So I had Camtasia, Snagit, and an old webinar recording. And that's what I was given. And like, here you go,
Wow.
Go do the thing. So in interviews, I usually just go through all of the letters of Addie in my head when I'm explaining my design process. I don't mention Addie. I don't mention any particular design process because that's not as important as me explaining my design process. And as a hiring manager, what I'm looking for is that you have a process, right? Is that you aren't missing steps because you don't have a process. And of course, every different project is going to change, but having those foundational steps in there is really important. So when I got the webinar recording, it was very much a very casual, like, here's how you find all the stuff on our platform. And there was a lot of like editorial comments and things that had to be pulled out of there. So, I really went to the objectives, which had already been kind of handed down to me from like the stakeholder. And I was like, all right, what from this webinar actually hits these objectives and what is just fluff? And a lot of it was fluff. And so I was able to take the transcript of the webinar and like just make a new outline based on it. Like, here are the key points, here are the high things. And so there was that bit of like needs analysis of, what do we actually need from this webinar? And I didn't have a subject matter expert to work with. It was just this recording, right? And so that was the SME, was this older recording. And so I was able to pull out the parts that I needed. And then in terms of design, I just rewrote a script that took all that editorial stuff out, right? And rewrote it as like, this video is going into the LMS, right? And then created like the treatment of like what would be on screen. Mostly with product stuff, it's screencast videos. So it's kind of easy when you're putting together like storyboard and design because a lot of it's just that. And then once that was reviewed, and I did have somebody finally internally who knew a lot about the product was able to look at it and say, oh, this is good, this isn't important. And so having that review process before I went and developed it all in Camtasia was really great. And then went and put it together in Camtasia and sent it back out for review. Then did all the functionality testing in the LMS because the LMS was new. So you had to do all like the testing to make sure it was working properly, completing properly, all that good stuff. Creating the assessment to go along with it, and then publishing. So
awesome. Wow. So it sounds like there were a lot of moving parts, and it's a great example of using a needs assessment and using or making sure that as you're working on this project, that it's getting reviewed and that you're taking time to pause before you move into the next step, and making sure that you have good feedback before you put out this product and implement this plan. So I love that.
I've seen it happen one too many times where someone gets like the treatment and they're like, okay, thanks. And then they disappear for like 3 months, and then they come back, they're like, here it is. And it's like done, but it's not what the stakeholder was looking for at all. So I think having those checkpoints after every kind of like step in the process is really good.
Awesome. Right. Ready for another question?
Yes, let's do it.
Awesome. All right. Tell me about a time when you had to lead a meeting or facilitate a training virtually. How did you keep your participants engaged?
I love this question. I have done some facilitation that was painstaking. So I worked for a software company, and they did mostly virtual instructor-led training for their product. So it had the potential of being really boring, and the way that it had been facilitated before, because it was facilitated by people who weren't from an L&D background. So no shade to them. They didn't know what they didn't know, right? But they would literally go through the product left to right, top to bottom, and say what every button and everything did. And it was so overwhelming. And it was like 4 hours long.
Oh, wow.
So it was brutal. And then trying to get full teams of like 5 or 6 people to sit there for 4 hours, it's just not really possible. So when I came in, I was an hour twice a week, and however many weeks it takes, so be it, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that I keep participants engaged is by like actually having them do things. I think that that's a really great way to keep them engaged is like with product training. Who wants to drive? Like, I don't have to show you everything. You can share your screen. You can sign into the product, and then I can just tell you where to go, or you can explore around and I can just tell you like what you're clicking on. And so it's a really great way. Like if you ask for a volunteer, which I always say, ask for a volunteer, don't volunteer people, because like we want to be respectful of people who don't want to be on camera or who don't want to volunteer. But once you start asking for volunteers, people are like, oh, I might have to do this. So they're more likely to pay attention, right? Because they're like, oh, it might be my turn next. But also just having them practice and get comfortable in the software is really great before they're even trying it out on their own. So it's kind of like a win-win. And then coming back from breaks in training is always really awkward, right? Like it's always like this, is everybody back? Is everybody back? Bill, are you back? You know? So I would always use like the Zoom polls. And the Zoom poll question would just be like, are you back from break? And once I had that many people, like all the people checked yes, then I knew it was okay to start. And I didn't have to do that like very awkward, like, hey, are you back? Hey, are you here? You know?
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I think is underutilized is that social aspect of learning, like breakout rooms. If you're not doing product training, if you're doing something that's more soft skills based or something where you can have people go and practice and discuss and answer questions in breakout rooms that you as the facilitator can just kind of like hop from room to room. That's how I used to run classrooms when I was a professor, but now we just have that option virtually. And I think people can learn so much from each other that's another really great way, not only to keep them engaged, but to get different perspectives too than just the facilitators.
I love that. What a great example of bringing your learner in and keeping your lessons interactive and helping them practice so they can learn the skills. I think that's such a great example. Yeah. Tell me about a time when you wanted to make a particular design decision, but a certain SME, stakeholder, or team member overruled you. What was the situation and how did you handle it?
So this is one of my favorite questions because for me, it's very personal. I admit my current team knows this, that visual design is not my area of expertise. It is not my strong suit. I was an English professor. I will write scripts all day. Word stuff, great. Visuals, not as great. So, and the other thing I think that's important about this question that I'll say before I answer it is that I think a lot of times there's this expectation that when you become an instructional designer, you get to be this really creative, artistic individual, and you have like all this creative license to make all these cool things. But I've never had 100% creative license unless I was working on something for me as a side hustle, right? Like with my podcast, I have full creative license, but working for corporate, no. And so I would run into like multiple situations with multiple bosses, especially when I was first starting out, coming from higher ed, where you get to do whatever you want, and however you design an assignment is how it goes out. And so my style, I think on my podcast, I described it as earthy, but I would also describe it as like very creative and bubbly and abstract. And I had a couple of different managers when I was first starting out. My first two managers, in fact, would say, this is not really like professional. So I was designing a slideshow, a series of slides for this like leadership meeting for one of our leaders to present on. And it was very pretty, but my manager was like, this is not very like professional executive. Like they wanted something more like sleek and modern and clean. And so the biggest thing to remember is like not to take it personally, right? Because like it's a style, right? It's a vibe. And if it's not your style, that's fine because you're not the end user. So it's important too to think, and that's something that I wasn't taking into consideration, right? Like who's using this? Who's presenting these slides? Who are the end, viewers? And so remembering that. And then my other thing is like, I think all of us, right? Our first reaction to negative feedback is like defense. And so the other thing that I have to do is I kind of have to like take a minute and pause and like process the feedback and remember not to take it personally. But there's this really great trick that I used to do with one of my colleagues. And we used to work together on projects a lot. So we would like both work on the same e-learning. And I highly recommend that if you have people that you feel really comfortable with, that you do this. We would do this, how much do you care? And we'd have like this little meter that we go higher or lower. And so when a decision came up and we didn't agree, she would always say, how much do you care? And like, if you'd raise your hand, that it was like, I will die on this hill, right? Like I will lose my job over this. And if you lower your hand, it's like, I don't really care that much. And so whoever cared more won out, right? Or if we both were kind of in the middle, we just talk it through and figure it out. But it's a great way so that you're not finding yourself arguing just for the sake of arguing, right? Like it's a great way to make sure that you get the changes made that you really feel passionate about, and the other person does too, without getting feelings hurt. So
that is such a great tip, because I think so often we can get trapped in this cycle of thinking that it's taking something personally and thinking that it's us. But the reality is you need to prioritize your learners. You need to prioritize your audience. And I think also making that distinction that a lot of times I think, instructional designers or those who are aspiring instructional designers may think that they have all this creative freedom, but saying like, no, we need to make sure that our designs are aligning with organizational priorities and aligning with our needs assessment. And I think that's a really important distinction that you made with this question. So awesome. Yeah. So for this final question, I wanted to ask number 10, because I think it would be really great for folks to really highlight their accomplishments and kind of think about where they want to go next with their careers. So number 10 says, what are some of your personal and professional goals?
So I love this question. And let me have a disclaimer here and say, do not give my actual answer as your actual answer, because my professional goals are someday to own my own business. And you probably don't want to share that in an interview. That's usually like,
fair.
You become a risk at that point, right?
Yeah.
Because like people are like, oh, well, unless you're going for like a freelance role, right? But if you're like going for a typical corporate and you're like, I want to own my own business one day, they're going to be like, how, when? Like, we don't want to hire you and have you leave in 6 months, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, if I were answering this question, personal goals, I think it's great to just share whatever those are, right? Like my personal goals are to travel more, especially now that my PhD is over and I'm going to have some extra time. Like I want to go places. I haven't been outside of the US and Canada, right? So I would love to, I haven't even been to many of the states within the US, right? So I want to travel. And I think that that's a great thing to share and to share those things that an interviewer is going to remember about you, right? Like and so I would even go a step further and say like, you know, I'd love to go to Europe, or say like specific personal goals so that somebody has something to either connect with if they have a similar goal, or something to remember you by. And then in terms of professional goals, I've always been really open about the fact that I want to work somewhere where I can grow and move up and be a people leader. And some people don't like to hear that. Some people are like, well, there's not really a path up in this role. But that helps you as the job seeker to know that that's not the role for you. Because if there's no upward mobility, you're going to have to make a change at some point and go somewhere else. So I think it's important to be upfront. Again, like maybe don't say you want to start your own business or like move into another field or be a billionaire or get into crypto and leave your job. Like, maybe not all those things, but like, you know, oh, I'd like to lead people someday, or, oh, I'd like to really develop my skills in this area. Like I would say like, oh, I really want to develop my visual design skills, right? And get better at that and pick those areas where you have a little bit more opportunity so that also the person knows like what to do with you if they hire you, right? Like what your professional development plan should be.
That's awesome. I think I love that you suggest sharing a personal detail about yourself that your interviewer can remember you by. And sometimes I know that can be a little, you don't know, should I share something personal? Should I not? But I think that that's such a great tip because it's, you know, it is something, it builds connection, for the interviewer to remember you. And also sharing your professional goal. I think it's great information to have if you share your aspirations and then you're told like, well, you know, I think that it's a great tip to talk about your professional goals and so that you can have an idea, if this organization is the right place for me or not, if I'm going to be able to grow here, if I'm going to be able to be challenged. So I love both of those tips.
Awesome. Good.
Yeah. Heidi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I think you shared so many wonderful nuggets and so much great advice with us today. And just really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. Well, that's all our time for today. Want to thank Heidi Kirby for joining us again on this episode of Ask a Trainer. If you want to find out how you can connect with Heidi, check out the show notes in the description box below. And if you want to know when our next episode of Ask a Trainer is going live, click on that subscribe button and stay tuned. I'm Jess Thompson, and thanks so much for watching.